when you help somebody and your own going through your own stuff, that's not help anymore. That's love. That's love in its purest form. Because here I am, might be thirsty, but I'm offering you the water first. Whatever God you're talking about, isn't that what it's about? You know, I mean, isn't that really what we're supposed to be here? And how we look at the greatest species of, I think, like ants and bees and all these super, that's how they work, one for all and all for one.
Michael Dederick is a chef, a father, a grandfather, an advocate for mental health, and so much more. Michael was born along the Hudson River in New York, and the river and the surrounding area have come to define his life in so many ways. Since the passing of his son Nicholas, Michael has dedicated himself to bettering mental health throughout the region and has been active in several advocacy organizations. I want to thank Michael for bearing his soul on the podcast today. I'm very grateful for this conversation and the insights into the life of a truly extraordinary individual. Let me know what you think of this episode, and be sure to like this episode and consider subscribing to the podcast. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks. Michael Dederick, how you doing today?
Good morning, everybody. I'm doing fairly well for kind of a nice overcast sunny, half Sunday morning in the Hudson Valley here.
You have an amazing background too, right on the Hudson River there. That's awesome.
It's part of my lineage here. It certainly is. As beautiful and awe-inspiring as a place can be sometimes, but in my story, you could see that as much light, there's also darkness in that. So but we learn that becomes one hell of a teacher. So it's good stuff.
There's a lot to learn from the positives and the negatives in life. I mean, it's kind of like a yin yang kind of aspect, right?
Absolutely. We're living in this world right now where we're actually seeing it happening in real time. Computers are giving us this ability to be able to share our stories in this type of fashion. And I think for all its woes and all its, getting adjustment to these human connections that we still need to have to be a species and conduct, is what needs to be said. You know, a lot of times our lives are controlled by our ego and our own will rather than the collective. And I think in our future, we need to make sure that our collective is intact. And these are going to be the abilities for us to be able to interconnect ourselves through telling our stories. So I thank you for having this podcast and allowing us to be able to do this sort of thing. It's really great medicine, is what it really is.
I totally agree. I mean, yeah, I want this podcast again to be a medium where everyone's able to share their story, and it's great how we can use technology in such positive ways. So I appreciate you being on the podcast today for sure. Talking about stories too, just real quick. I just wanted to ask you, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I essentially come from right here in this room, pretty much. I was born in 1968, September 14th, so leaves me to be a Virgo. So I tend to be a little bit very analytical. I've actually got a lot of my insight in my life. Really, you can't see it in the screenshot here, but there's a stone bench that overlooks this beautiful view here that's been here long before I have been. This is a family estate. And through my deep epigenetical history here, my mother and I are essentially the last ones standing. So this family estate that was once bestowed to us by our grandfather and my grandmother has now been left as the sole survivors here of this wonderful property. It's definitely a deep challenge because of my story, and also because, as I was mentioning off camera, how much light and awe-inspiring this has. There is also darkness with this because, as every family has, we have what I call like the haunted landscape of our soul, which kind of goes really deep into who we are. I call it as a chef. I've been a chef in the Hudson Valley for better than 30 years. Graduate not too far away from here, up in High Park. I've kind of gone full circle in my life. Early in my childhood, I was born pretty much on this property right across the river at Vassar Hospital, which you can see from the property by all means. but it wasn't quite as silver spoon as you might think. There were a lot of my grandfather died when my mother was 9 years of age. He died tragically in a car accident. He was actually, I would like to consider him kind of like the Elon Musk of his day. He was one of the lead engineers on the 34th Street subway system, the Holland Tunnel. He was a big engineer in the Delaware Aqueduct, the water source to New York City, all kinds of mining projects and civil engineering journals. He was essentially the guy that was writing them up into the early 1936, 1938 ish, until he tragically died in a car accident over in Liberty, New York. Deep history. It is deep family, a lot of lineage. I'm learning more in 56 years of my life about my family now that I've actually been bestowed this property, and being able to kind of still have the ability to look back at these stories. I have boxes that are actually surrounding me here of letters that my grandmother and my grandmother corresponded, because back in the day certainly wasn't like this. They would never even envision this, but it was old school cursive writing, and these letters that just were emotionally filled and emotionally charged. Come to find out, long story short, my grandfather was 27 years my grandmother's senior. So there was quite an age disparity there. He was, I guess, a modern day Mick Jagger. To say, God bless. But the other part of it that kind of makes it a little odd, and uncovering just recently, was they were never married. My grandmother had my mother, and then 9 months, a few months later, had my uncle. 9 months, a few months later, had my other uncle. So my mother is the oldest out of three. And strangely enough, everybody died in opposite fashion. My uncle, one Uncle Willie, died first, and then my other uncle died about 20 years later, just a few years ago after COVID. And now my mother, being the oldest, is essentially the one that has persevered through all that. Deep epigenetical things, not just being the fatherless child syndrome. My grandmother was alcoholic. Substance abuse ran in my family from my grandfather to my biological father was not only an alcoholic, but he was also a gambler. Metro North runs right over here, so I hear the train every so often. You might hear a whistle through the meeting. I've always longed for that. And also through my journey of working in the city, I used to take the train as homage to my father because he used to work for IBM. So he would take that train to the city every day. And I had a great story after my father died many years, 20 something years later. I was working in the city as a chef, and he says there hasn't been a good card game on this train since your father passed away. So it was kind of a great testimonial, but it also showed him how much he was, because he was a gambler. He owed people money. He had some darkness that went into that. Sadly, my mother and father, they weren't ready for kids. I was an only child. They were kind of, as I would put it in this day and age, knowing what I know now, what they would call trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is when you find this likeness into two things and it becomes the source of the relationship. But at the end of the day, when it sheds all away, it's completely unhealthy. And because of my mother's alcoholism at her time, and my stepfather, my biological father's gambling and alcoholism, you can only assume how that was for raising a child. So, needless to say, they split when I was in just merely 2 years of age. So, I really didn't have a lot of great recollection of my father, with the exception of weekends with him. He was a great tennis player, bridge and chess, which is something that I still hold. Not bridge, but the backgammon. Backgammon and chess were two games that he taught me at a very young age, and I still like to play and engage in that. So I always feel that that's a lineage to him. And the other part of it was, he was a great Yankee fan. So I remember going as a kid to Yankee Stadium, go to the city with him on a, take your kid to work day type of thing. And then we go to a Yankee game. And one of the most memorable experiences I had with him, sits me on my lap and he looks down. And of course, it's a baseball game. I'm a young kid. It's hard to pay attention to 9 innings. But he made sure I paid attention to this one thing. And it was, Guy with number 44 playing for the Milwaukee Brewers at this time, and it was Hank Aaron. And he says, no matter what's going to happen in your life, you're going to remember this guy's name. And I didn't really pay a lot of attention till it, of course, until the memories, right? Until my father died when I was in fifth grade. And now all those types of things just become the memories. And that was one of the things that I've always held dear. And looking back on that, I think like Thurman Munson, Catfish Hunter, all these great Yankees, not only with that, but it was, Yankees were a dynasty back in that day and age. So it was really one of those magical moments that we share with our loved ones that we hold on to forever. There's times where you can get into deep meditation and almost bring you back to that, 7, 8 year old little boy that was sitting on your father's lap. So I've always been cherished to be able to have those memories and also have those memories conjoined with as much as my life was kind of stable because we lived with this foundation of this property that at one point was spanning 15 acres when my other uncle was alive and but because there was so deep epigenetical wounds, because my family's love was always transactional, it was never emotionally given. So therefore it was done by, what you could achieve or what you could do or what you could bring to the table or how hard you could work, right? It was just like, as a child, I was growing up with adults. So I was an only child. So my grandmother used to have these amazing parties on this property, and as a kid, I loved it because it was the lead up to the party that I loved. The people showing up, because back then it wasn't just like they wheeled in on a Friday and stayed till Saturday and out on Sunday. People would wheel in on a Wednesday, stay at the house for a little while, and there was always pre-up. And this is how kind of I became a chef. My grandmother was an exquisite cook, so everything was used. If it wasn't used for human consumption, it was used for the dogs and the animals that we had in the house. And we were always with the SPCA, so we were always able to give love to animals easier than we were able to give love to our fellow human beings and our family sometimes. But I was growing up in a while where kids were to be seen and not heard. There are certain things you do and certain things you don't do. My mother's side of the family was German, so a very strict authoritarian style lifestyle you could see. My father's side of the family, which I didn't get to really get to know until actually later part of my life, which I'll get to in a little while, but because I was estranged after my family split up when I was second grade, my mother started dating another individual, became my stepfather. Unfortunately, we had a really difficult relationship because he kind of ruled with an iron fist, both physically, and being the fact that my mother was, had addictive issues with alcoholism, it made it difficult as an only child to kind of grow up by yourself like that. We moved around a lot through my high school years. By the time I graduated high school, I was in 10 different schools from New York to California to New Jersey. My father was in, my stepfather was involved in the Silicon Valley part of the world. So what happened was he started with, of course, everybody started with IBM, right? IBM back in the 60s and the 70s was the forever job up here in the Hudson Valley. They never fired anybody, but he worked into other industries, Fairchild and some other companies up and coming, and ended up going out to which actually became what Silicon Valley and the tech industry. But this was again in the 70s. So I was in and out of a lot of schools, and of course, kind of feeling that I didn't matter, growing up as an only child and the fact that there was never really play dates and I was always just put into these adult environments where I was, you know, in my early days, I felt like I was the 7, 8 year old little bartender, the person that would get you something. I used to be referred to, and some people might, if they're my age, might reflect upon it. Used to be called Meathead. Meathead is a All in the Family and Archie Bunker. Michael, the kid in that, was Meathead. So that was me growing up. That hey Meathead, what can you get me this? Meathead, what are you doing, Meathead? I mean, it was always those types of things. So it wasn't really a healthy environment to do compassion, empathy, and nourishment for a child. So I was always left to my own devices, and in doing so, most of the instances weren't good. because I was the kid that was able to hang out after the lights went, street lights went on, which get me to another different element, which if they were that kids, typically they had their own troubled issues. So again, we all kind of bond together and created all kinds of mayhem, no matter where I was. And I've essentially been this big since eighth grade. I'm a big Irish galoomp, if you will. And so I was always challenged as the new kid on the block, right? I was always coming in. I had fire red hair at the time. My red had to change is more getting gray and blonde. I like to say it with my balding spot on the head. But back in the day, I was howdy doody. I was this kid that always got little edged and, I guess in this day, bullied. But because I had size, I would get challenged. And, nowadays, Jesus, nowadays, who knows what that would take you? Because if you do get in fights in schools now, it's actually in the hands of the police, which doesn't really go to the core of issues. Why is a kid fighting? And when I agreed to mental health issues that I do now in my life, it's an acting out. There's a reason why this child is so angry. There's a reason why this child is throwing things. There's a reason why, and it could be the perfectly good parent, but there could be something else that's emotionally not stable with it. And for me, it didn't matter what the attention was as long as I was getting attention. And let's just say, boy, did I, My mother got sober when I turned 18. So there was a changing point there. But as that would have it for me, sex, drugs, and rock and roll became a big part of my life at that age. So as she put down the bottle and put the plug in the jug, I was just getting started, right? You know, it never became known, but my mother ended up going into rehab because of my stepfather believed that she had drank this bottle of Absolute vodka. Well, the story was I stole that vodka and I drank it. But in her cognitive bit, she didn't realize it. She ended up going into a rehab and got herself sober for the rest of her life. And of course, for me, that was, the genie, it didn't go back in the bottle for me. That night I ended up ruining my friend's camper. It was a pop up camper. You can imagine how horrific that was. I ended up sleeping in a forsythia bush that day. I had legitimate alcohol poisoning and I was 16 years of age, probably a freshman in high school about that time. But it wasn't my first time drinking. It was my first time drinking to that extent. But, I was a troubled kid. I was always, finding living in those fringes as an only child, trying to find a way to fit into whatever community I could. A lot of times it was from the bad boys, the kids that sat in the back of the classroom, sat in the back of the bus, that sort of thing. It was a different day and age that it was now. I wasn't, I was kind of bullied, but I stood up to him. So it was different. If somebody ended up with a black eye, a fat lip, or whatever the case may be, sometimes we actually, became friends actually after that. I actually had one kid that I grew up with, Gary, his name was, a big dude. And we used to, if we were like Fraser Ali at times, because we had like so many bouts over the years, and then we would hang out, then we wouldn't hang out. But it was how we became, conduct, we ended up creating a bond in some way. And, but what I was getting to before was, the history of this property and this history of my family's history with my grandfather and everything else. And my grandmother used to having these elaborate parties. And, I wanted to feel like I belonged in there. And of course, as a kid and an only kid, I was left to my own devices. And, there was no other kids here. It was always adults. So, but what I learned and kind of led me into the hospitality industry was the idea that I felt like it gave me the ability to become meaningful to somebody, right? What's more meaningful than feeding somebody nourishment? And as a chef, it just became a natural reaction. What's greater than having somebody come in and care for you, where they're making a meal, serving you a meal, washing the dishes, and doing all the things that the hospitality industry does? And that's why it was a natural connection to me. So I loved cooking earlier on. My mother was a horrible cook, so I knew the difference. She was the Stofers and TV dinner and chicken pot pie type of person growing up. So it never, but I knew what good food tastes like, and I knew what, going to the farm tastes like, and I knew what all that great stuff. And that's what got me the seed, right? That's what got me the seeds that it says, hey, this is where I want to go. And then, of course, earlier, so we're talking late 80s, the restaurant business was in its heyday. Three martini lunches, Cajun Creole food, the world was getting smaller. Different infusions were starting to come in, gastronomically speaking. I graduated the culinary not too far away from here in High Park, and they had the world's greatest chefs. There were 27 certified master chefs in the country at the time in the United States, nine of which were on the Culinary Institute's payroll, most of which were Eastern European, hard edged, go cry in the walk in type of guys. They're no longer there, but they were a big part of the industry. I mean, the industry is diversified in just in my words, where it was male dominated. When I was first getting in, it was still male dominated. Now it's becoming a much evener flux, which is great. But it was interesting in going to a school that was, wasn't, it was more male, what people were in the curriculum. So definitely there was always those things that, you know, the industry gave me was seeing the diversification of everything, because not even the fact but we also got to, you met the farmers, you also met the people who picked and grew, and your dishwashers and your food preppers from all over the world. And obviously one of the great people that became part of my mentoring, and one of the people I really looked up to at the time, was Anthony Bourdain, for two reasons. Number one, I love the way he spoke truth to power, and the idea that he, Kitchen Confidential came out and he was telling all our ugly secrets. Don't, the bread's being reused, the butter, don't trust the butter, and don't buy fish on Monday. I mean, these were all, sad truths about our industry. And his truth and his shows really depicted how I felt, that I learned my Indian cooking from a Pakistani dishwasher. I watched how he prepared, because they are, no matter where you're from, you're going to cook more authentic than I could. So if I can just take my traditional principles that I've always learned about, you do French techniques, but Italian principles in cooking, which means that you use the brunoise, the saute, the braise, all the wonderful techniques that the French have created. But when it comes to cooking, you do it with the bounty of the garden, like the Italians. And you do it with the garlic and the herbs and the oils and the vinegars, and everything just comes alive. Because one of the things I teach my chefs now and my up and coming chefs, there's a great quote that was told to me many years ago, that the home chef is 15 ingredients, the sous chef is 10 ingredients, the good chef is 5 ingredients, and the great chef is 3 ingredients. And people look at me like, what the fuck are you talking about? And what I mean by that is, if you're a great chef, you don't compromise. You're buying the best of the best. You're buying the organic carrot. You're buying the best. So, and if you're buying it in the way it should be, whether it's fish, whether it's meat, whether it's vegetables, it doesn't need much else. A little salt, a little vinegar, a little acid, a little fat, you're done. The vegetable, Mother Nature gives us that ability to create that full creation of food. And, sadly, an American diet has not gone that way, with sugar, with processed foods, with everything else. I've also bared witness to that in my industry in the past 30 years of my existence. Is, wow, we've gotten so far away from the farm field. We've gotten more to fill food. We're, creating food in laboratories now and not in farm fields. We have taken the nutrients out of the soil. But as a chef and working at some pretty prestigious places over my lifetime, I've been written up in Wine Spectator magazine. I was written up in Bon Appetit magazine. I was able to, at one point in my life, be able to run this home actually as a B&B and a wedding venue. I also had my own restaurant at one time. And then, of course, getting back to my family, the wheels come off the wagon. My financial partner, AKA my uncle, drops dead of a heart attack without a will. So our 15 acres of property overlooking the Hudson River goes down to five, because my grandmother had a irrevocable living trust. She knew her children weren't able to get along with each other because of deep epigenetical wounds that date back to how they were raised. My grandmother was a wonderful grandmother to me, but kind of not a great mother to her children. So that was always something that I had to learn to get to. But of course, and of course, when my uncle passed away and I just had bought a house, I was just after the heels. I had done all this thing where I was running a business. And for a chef at 36 years of age to get their foot in the door to open up a restaurant, it's pretty big things, you know? I mean, I was thinking I was on top of the world. And of course, in my journaling after he died and I was about to lose everything, including this property, I was just like, oh, I'm in the worst point of my life. Well, I had to really take a note on that. I went down a deep road. One of the things I neglected to say early on in my addiction after my mother, my getting into that, I not only went quickly from drugs or from alcohol, from that bottle of vodka, to not so many years later to a coke addiction. 17 years of age, I dropped out of high school. I was doing bad things, going to the city, living completely fearlessly with a death wish, got myself into such an oblivion that my first suicide attempt was at 17 years of age. I don't really want to talk about it, but to go back to talking about some things, I sat in a car with the garage note outside. My folks were in Aruba. My parents never knew about this till I was later on in life, right? So going through all these things, the restaurant business, obviously full of misfits, full of people like me. I made a home. I worked down in the city. Years later, I opened up this restaurant, B&B. My uncle dies of a heart attack. I end up rehatching that cocaine habit that I once had as a child at 17. And at 36 years of age, it was as if I never stopped. And I was down this dark road again. When I was 17, my problem was I blamed my father's death on myself. My father died of a heart attack, had nothing to do with me. But as a child, the way I felt about it, it was my fault. He died of a broken heart. He died because I was an unlovable child. He died, all these things. I carried this shit till my 20s until I was like, what am I doing? Right. So, all these struggles that I've gone through my whole life, whether the idea of I've been just turned on to the word death doodler, somebody who's always on the doorstep of somebody else that's passing. And you're never really, it's not something you choose to do, it's something that you just become. And because, of my father's death, I've lost a lot of people close to me over my lifetime. My grandmother, my two uncles. But this is where the story gets hard edge. My grandmother had just passed away. She had left me a little bit of something as a chef. I wanted to go explore. I was a New York City guy. I was working in the city down there. I was River Cafe, watching the Twin Towers, drinking gin giblets, thinking I have arrived. And I decided what's next. So I decided to go to Europe. But unfortunately, before I went to Europe, not fortunately or unfortunately, I was sowing my oats. I got my girlfriend pregnant and I was off to Europe. I went on the journey because my feeling was if I didn't, I would always regret not doing it. Right. So I went over there. I spent 4 months over there trying to find myself. I worked in a few kitchens as what they call staging over there. You go over, work for free, room and board, and you get to just get the experience of working in a French chateau or a French restaurant. Fantastic. I did get a little sideways over there. I kind of got off track because of my addictions, kind of hanging out with some friends I knew in London. Then before you know it, I'm leaving over to Amsterdam. And then, you can know where it goes from there, right? Coming home, I then had my son, Nicholas, with my girlfriend. He was born on November 14th, 1998. We were 30 years and 2 months apart. I was born in 68. He was born in 98. And 11/14 was his birthday. My birthday is 9/14. It was a difficult relationship, very similar to how my mother and father were. It wasn't built to last. There was too much trauma bonding. There was too much poison into the relationship. So we never really married. We split. There was a lot of what you called in this day and age called adverse childhood experiences. ACEs is what it's called. It's a 10-point question that says if you have A, B, and C, everything else multiplies from that. Addictions, depression, different types of anxieties, different types of mental health, sex rate, your success rate in different types of things. All these things just add to these multipliers. And of course, myself, looking at it, had a few of those myself. And of course, my son was now burdened with this. And we had a difficult relationship for lots of beauty within it. Don't misunderstand me, but my relationship with him and his mother was very difficult, which had a direct reflection on him. That again, we kind of forget about our children, right? At times like this, we're all about our ego and our own sense of insecurities and stuff. So uh, we were estranged. My uncle that I was in business with drops dead of a heart attack. We're in business. The house, my son was now 5 years, he was going into second grade. My ex had two other children from a previous marriage. Their father died of an overdose. So there was all this deep turmoil of drama and trauma that was just percolating like a jacuzzi, just constantly going on. And of course, when my uncle died, the wheels came off the wagon for me too. I jumped back into my drug addiction days. I was an alcoholic up until that point, but as a chef, I always said I was a connoisseur. It was my excuse, right? Oh, I didn't need to have this. Well, it's brand new. I got to try the new vintage. I got to try this. And before you know it, it just was an excuse over the years. So I had to get over that. But after my uncle died, things fell apart. My mother lost her home up here. They moved to South Carolina, Charleston. My ex with my son, as I was struggling through an addiction, everybody kind of bailed on me at that time from my perspective. I mean, I guess I was my own choices in my life, but you know, I live with the AA principles now, being 8 years sober, that if you're ever in need, may the hand of AA always be there for you. So you have to meet that person for where they're at. And a lot of times that's not the case for when a person's in the throes of their own darkness or their addictions. So what happened was I struggled through things. That was my second suicide attempt. Thank goodness I had a loved one in my presence that got me help that I needed. Took me to a psych center. Got to see a lot of the brokenness of within the system. They gave me the Wellbutrin, the Zoloft, the Seroquels. Well, as a chef, it makes you very vanilla. Doesn't work. Your creative mind loses. You become a couch potato. I love to hike. I love to mountain bike. I love to do hockey. I was that type of outdoorsman type of thing. But with those type of medications, you just wanted to be a couch potato. You didn't really have the ambition and the enthusiasm to really want to do those things. So it really wasn't working for me. And again, I picked up with my alcoholism yet again. Always going half measures, as they call it. I tell kids today when I look at my sobriety records, I show them my 8 white chips. The 8 white chips are your 30-day chips. I have 7 of them, right? So that shows you how many times I had the number one, the balls to go into the rooms and sit there for 30 days to get the white chip. But there was many times I tried to get through that dry January and I couldn't do it. I would, or certainly never made it past the Super Bowl. So that was always my window of time of sobriety of growing up. My parents were all tower drinkers. My mother was the only one out of the family that got sober, which I also attribute that to her long life. She's going to be 83 tomorrow. So it's like, um, but anyhow, as the walls were crumbling for me and my struggle of getting my handle on my addiction, my financial insecurity, my parents, my son moving away, feeling very much how my father might have felt after I moved to California when I was a young boy and didn't get to see him as much. So I moved to South Carolina, tried to become that, and Charleston was a great city. It's a great food city. It blended well for my career. I did well down there. I was able to be engaged in my son's. He was becoming a pretty solid football player. Down there, they play big ball. So it was, see, 6'4", 215 pounds, starting varsity tight end for a team that was ranked 7th in the nation in high school football. His junior year, they went 15-0. They won the state championship. They played in the Carolina Gamecocks Stadium down there, and he was on a roll. Going into his senior year, however, he got his girlfriend pregnant, and he was struggling with life issues of becoming a baby daddy or being a star football player, and it wasn't going well. Unfortunately, on August 28th, 2016, my life changed. The loss of anybody that was before me paled in comparison. On August 2016, my son, Nicholas Dederick, took his life to suicide. I've never been the same man. That person that once was is no longer here. That person just no longer exists. It's difficult to hear sometimes because the conversations that dad used to be involved in and the worst of the pronoun of dad sometimes no longer applies to me. I do have two grandchildren in my life, well, in the world, not necessarily in my life right now, which is something I'm hoping will change. But my son was acting out with another girl. So my grandson was born in May. My son took his life in August, and my granddaughter was born in December. Two separate women, obviously, and two separate stories. My grandson, Hudson, who is wonderfully, I feel, bestowed the name I want to name my son, and also the beautiful river that flows behind me, I feel there's a connection that I was able to help name my grandson. There's wounds with that that's still ongoing, and I'm hoping that at some point we'll be able to find a way to become that. But after suicide, there's a lot of blame. Even in my sobriety today, my sponsor says to me, "Do you forgive your son for what he did that day?" And of course, he was a child. He was a kid. He was working on an impulsive act that you couldn't walk back. But then the question is, do you forgive yourself? And as a father, I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to, because grief isn't something that you find a way to get through. You're on grief's terms. It works. You don't get through grief. Grief gets through you, and it's how we go through it. And if we if we go through our trauma through avoidance and suppression and ignoring it, that it actually happens, it's going to manifest itself in some way. I just explained to you a good portion of my I'm 8 years sober now. So my sobriety, by the way, my son took his life on August 28th, 2016. I wasn't even 90 days sober yet. I was still in my early sobriety. I had gotten sober because my son said he was going to have a child. And I knew that if I was going to walk into this idea of being a grandfather and teaching my son how to be a baby daddy, I needed to put the plug in the jug. I needed to find a way to be able to be the light in all the dysfunction that was surrounding him and surrounding me. And one of the biggest things that I feel that I never talked to him about was I did mention to him about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I never mentioned to him about the demons that plague us in our head. I never once talked to him about my 2 suicide attempts. Never thought it was supposed to be talked about. Because if we talk about it, then you're afraid somebody's going to give somebody an idea. But what it means is that you're actually realize that, wow, I'm not the only one. I'm not alone here. It's so crazy. So many people, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. When I go to speaking and when I start to talk about things now. And it's all gone hand in hand with me in this grief and love, because it's the love is where the grief becomes where the love has nowhere to go. So it manifests itself in some way. And for me, rather than going into the darkness that unfortunately my narrow pathways want to take me to sometimes, I have to create new narrow pathways. And in doing that has been my healing point of grief and beyond. Since my son's passing, I've done narrow feedback and brain mapping. I've stayed sober because no matter what you're going through in life, you have to do it with clear eyes. You're not going through anything if you're sedating yourself. You're not going through anything if you're numbing yourself. You're just giving yourself excuses. And the only way to truly do that is to really, and now I get it. I have done, I, now that I say that, I am sober from alcohol, but with my psychologist and my therapists also as prescribed, I do medical marijuana. I don't do the edibles. I'm an old hippie, so I still do with flower. I still do a certain strand of sativa, which works with my dopamine and receptors in my brain. So I understand how it's working. I don't do it as a crutch. I do it as prescribed. So I don't do it to ever get out of my element. I don't do any of the other things that recreational marijuana has become at our doorstep with. I really feel that we're missing the boat at what it can do medically specifically. And the other thing that I've also done is what, especially around dates, my son's anniversary, his birthday, all the big things, holidays, things that really have a difficult time. I've done what they call microdosing, where I've used psilocybin through mushrooms. And again, trying to keep this organic and also not doing it to get the high, to getting to kind of just muffle the energy a little bit, to maybe change the different thought process on how you looked at it so I can change my story. So I don't have to keep telling me that story of that 7-year-old kid that felt like he didn't belong and kept trying to find a way to belong by doing whatever it took. That it's okay. It wasn't your fault. That my mother at 83 years of age is now healing from some of this deep epigenetical wounds that were given to her by her mother. And even though her mother's not here, my belief has become, after my son passed, it was in South Carolina, a mega church. There had to be close to 3,000 people down there. He was a star football player. He affected a community. He was not only that, but also his points that we created through our spirituality, our hikes, because there came a point in time where I needed to find a way to get to my son, right? I couldn't complete, and this was earlier. This was many years earlier. I couldn't compete with the video games. I couldn't compete with the girlfriends. I couldn't compete with couldn't play one-on-one basketball with that anymore. I couldn't race him anymore. He was kicking my ass everywhere I turned. I mean, he was becoming a formidable opponent. There was a few things I could still do with him, which I could still beat him in chess. I was taking up tennis, which was my father's sport. So there were things that I was able to kind of do with him, but the true things that we started to do was hike, because out in the wilderness, that's Mother Nature's reboot, man. That's the ability where the devices don't work for a reason. In my point, it becomes a point where we could talk mano a mano. We could talk about what life is, how it's treating you, what the feelings are that we really want to talk about. It becomes true and pure on the trail. And when you're on the trail, not just for an hour or 2 hour walk in the woods, but when you're on the trail up in the Catskills, which can be an 8 hour day. I mean, my days on the hiking trail we'd be there, at sunrise, and we'd be coming down with our headlamps, at dark. The first one on the trail and the last one off the trail. I used to look at that like, yeah, we did it. It was just great. And he was always exhausted, and he would always bitch and moan about it for like the first mile and a half. And then you just get into your zone, right? And then you feel like you could just hike forever. And that area up there, especially around the Tibetan monastery up in Overlook Mountain, and comes to this heritage of this land that we are so blessed with in the Hudson Valley. And where it gets me to mental health and how we can go forward with this is, since my son's passing, I've been trying to find a way to put paint to purpose. So in doing so, how do I do that? For one, I had a shower to myself. As I said before, I had 30 days, didn't even have 90 days sober. What kept me sober during that time? The AA rooms. They showered me with love until I could find a way to love myself again. Every single day, twice a day, no matter how many times I needed to go there, I got to share my story with somebody. I got to help people help me along the way. The grief groups from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, to walk into these rooms, to knowing people that walked in these same painful shoes. I then got involved with a group called Hope Rocks out of Saugerties, New York. They arts and music. The fact that we have put so much pressure on kids They're not getting what we call emotional intelligence to be able to navigate difficult life situations. There's a saying that says if we don't create strong and resilient children, we'll be left to fix broken and shattered men. It's much easier to raise strong and resilient children. So that has kind of been my passion. And my latest passion has been also walking with a group called Healthy Minds for Children, which is a local advocacy group that is small and mighty, but it's put me in front of Dutch legislators. It's put me in front of senators. It's allowed me to tell my story on a thing. But I do get the bobblehead politicians that, oh yes, it's such necessary. We're epidemic proportions. 1 in 5 kids is dealing with this. Suicides are through the roof, especially in the Hudson Valley. They're jumping off of all the bridges we have here. You know, the Mid Hudson Railroad Bridge has more jumpers than the Vezanaros Bridge in Manhattan, in Queens. So that goes into perspective. We have a broken mental health system, almost barbaric. As we look at where ShopRite is up in High Park, if anybody's familiar with the Hudson Valley, in the shadow of that was our mental health care facility, because it was old. My grandmother actually worked there. It was an insane asylum, and it was archaic. And we have yet to change those modalities. What has helped me wasn't the Zoloft and the Wellbutrin and the Seroquel. It numbed me. It put me in a different place. It maybe put me in a safer place. I don't know. But unless I was able to transform all this pain, not just from my son's death, but all the stuff in my life, I was always going to be stuck. I was always going to be continuous this cycle. So what I had to find out, and what I feel like it is now, that what I'm trying to do isn't the idea of trying to help each other. It's actually throwing love. So it's all this love I wanted to give to my son and my grandchildren that I can't, it seems a little stuck. I tried to give to another through empathy and compassion and through acts of kindness to one another. Because in this world that we're living in right now more than ever, where we're seeing so much division and so much rileness over the things, one of the things I've noticed in this journey, that overdoses, mental health, and suicide, it doesn't matter if you're Republican or a Democrat. It's happening on both sides. It's nobody's free from it. I look at it with Anthony Bourdain. I look at it with Robin Williams. I look at it with Chris Cornell. I mean, the list goes on and on. You know, these were people that we looked at. Oh my God. I sometimes say it to myself, if Anthony couldn't make it, how the fuck am I? And the only way I can is to be able to treat life to where it's teaching me. The truth of it is to be able to be a witness to your life and to be able to sit at the feet of your life and understand the lessons that you're being taught. And if you miss that lesson, chances are the universe is going to keep giving it to you, right? Until we find that way to work through it. And then in my son's funeral, when it was big church and it was a priest, and of course I said to the priest, I said, what type of God does this? You know, to have another fatherless child syndrome going on because of me, my mother. I just mentioned everybody that in my circle that all had this father. I had always said to my son, we were breaking the cycle. We were breaking that cycle, him and I. But then when he leaves 2 children behind, it's obviously that cycle is still well entrenched. So what he said to me was very profound. And he said, you have to understand, this wasn't God's will. This was human will. And it was God who cried first. And when he said that to me, as profound as that was, it is the crux of it all, isn't it? Isn't it our egos that really stand in the way of our own salvation? It's the thing that doesn't allow us to become vulnerable. It doesn't allow us to show compassion because we have to be geared up into this box and this wall that we put in. And until we find a way to break down that wall and to really become the deeper part of the onion, as I put it, we're always going to be stuck into that cycle. And it's the idea in what Buddhism also teaches you is, life is painful, but the suffering becomes optional. And if you look at some of the people that have had to endure, yes, my suffering has been a lot. Losing my world is upside down, because that's what the Native Americans say. The world is out of order. You're not supposed to lose your children before yourself. You lose your parents, you become an orphan. You lose your sibling, your significant other. You become a widower. There's no real name. There is a name for it, but it's a pain that's too hard to explain, and it's Valhalla, I believe, is the name. And it's because the pain is so deep, it's hard to put into words. Um, so all those things. But for me, and my idea through Buddhism allows me to know that that energy is just merely transformed. That energy is still here. He's flying in these prayer flags. His energy is where he is. I am trying to connect with him through what I do, whether it's the brain mapping and changing my own narrow pathways out of the addictive part, out of the impulsive part, and out of the trauma part that has always been on reverb my whole life. And now trying to take the dials to try to move it around a little bit, which is what I'm doing. But understanding that it's ancient. This ancient organism that we have involved in this skull has only been really changed in the past century or so to this point. We have this innate ability to go into it. One of the great things that I've learned through neurofeedback and brain mapping is that it was always there. Sanskrit, these ancient mantras, these ancient words that were devised for healing, these ancient frequencies that are about healing our inner chakras, that are about enlightening our minds, that they've been there for centuries and they've been used as centuries. And now, with tools like the internet, they can come to everybody's device if we allow that energy to want to work through us. My daily regiment these days is brain mapping neurofeedback every 2 weeks. I keep myself connected with hiking, mindfulness, meditation on the daily and the regular, whether it's a short hike around the property. I haven't been to be able to do those 8-hour hikes that I so longing for, but I'm eventually hoping to get back on that track. I try to do yoga and qigong to keep myself, sound baths, sound and hypnotherapy, as we are all vibration. And when we realize that that can be kind of our astral plane to transport us into this beautiful network of life and our interconnectedness, if we will, that we are not separate from nature, we are part of nature. And the idea that in so many of the songs we're just walking each other home, and the idea to become this ripple effect by our own actions. So I think that for me, with all these cautionary tales that I have about my life that go so much deeper than we could probably put into a whole podcast here, I really see at some point this could be a Netflix series. Taking back to my grandfather coming over from Germany, building the subway systems and seeing how that ran, to my grandmother's years of her dysfunction of growing up and living on this beautiful bluff, and her kids who were my uncles who opened up a business for 30 years. And then, of course, my life coming into being what they call breaking that cycle generation, because I'm confronting all the things. I'm confronting my, planetary, my astrological planetary people, which people might understand what that means. And I'm not really sure on how it exactly means, but it's some of the shamanic work that I'm doing now, is that if you put yourself into this position that you are the center of your own universe, right? Your mother is a planet, your father's a planet, your grandparents, any of the people that are in your life are your surrounding orbits. They're the ones that have the direct reflection on who you are. And if you start to see some of the stuff in which they are that melts into who you are, then that's when you kind of call it that shadow work, if you will, where you start to see, okay, wait a minute, I have some of these great qualities, but I also have some of these darker qualities. So it's the idea to be able to shed and adapt to the things that no longer serve you. So my life now isn't looking at the exit sign, as the suicidal ideation had for so many years. The depression comes and goes, the talks coming and going. The fact that I was up at 6 o'clock this morning, trying not to have a panic attack, be about bearing my soul to all on the internet is something to be said. I mean, there's a rawness in this. There's a part of it that really allows us to have the human condition that we all have. And if I can help somebody open up to that and to allow them to say, you know, something, you're right. You know, wow, how are you doing this? And being able to, you know, create positive feedback and putting your pain into purpose. And now going forward, I'm realizing that I can't just take this argument to my local organizations. I got to take it to Albany. I got to take it to the local philanthropists. I got to try to find a way to stir the shitstorm and to get mental health where it needs to be. Because right now, there's nowhere in the country we could actually look to saying, oh, this works and this works and this works. Yeah, there's good, silver linings in a lot of this stuff, but nothing, everything's living in silos, right? How do we find to create this way that it's going to be more beneficial for the greater and not just the few? And understanding that walking through any mental health issue is individual. We could be both suffering from the same sort of depression or same sort of PTSD, but yours might be from being in action in Iraq and Afghanistan, and mine might be just from living through a traumatic experience at home. You know, whether it's a suicide or a murder or it's something really horrific to that nature, and it's all different degrees. Dr. Gabermonte says it's not about the addiction, but why the pain. So what is it that we're holding on to that we can't seem to let go and let them? We're always trying to, and when we do that, we lose sight of ourselves, right? And I've said to myself is in my sobriety, no matter what I lose anymore, I'm not going to lose myself. And that means I can't allow myself to get caught into, whether that's, enabling, which is another issue where we fall so dark into trying to fix somebody that there's nothing you could do. You have to, in my case, if I didn't put the oxygen mask on myself first, to get myself into a spiritual wellness, to sobriety, to some sort of groundingness, I'm no help to anybody else. What do they talk about in relationships? You can't love somebody until you truly love yourself. I'm still working on that, which is why I'm single, which is why I have a hard time in my interpersonal relationships. I've longed for this long intimacy that I've never had because it never came to me as a child, as being a nurtured child. So when it comes to me in my adult life, I'm like, oh boy, although I can be very open about my story and I can be very intimate about my story. But then once it starts to get the deeper part of the onion, there's a thing that I've worked through, which is called intimacy anorexia. Intimacy anorexia is the inability to be able to show true love and the ability to accept true love. So the idea is when we get to a deep, loving relationship, there becomes a wall. And for me, a lot of times it was sabotage. A lot of times it was trauma bonding. A lot of times it was relationships that were going to work. But now that's all out on the table. So now what's holding me back, right? So I have to continue to find a way to work through that journey. So therefore, I can continuously open myself up. And in opening ourselves up and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable with empathy, compassion, and wisdom is actually the most ultimate sense of courage and strength because you're doing it with such confidence in yourself. You're doing it with such boundaries with yourself. You're doing it with such, ability to feel comfortable in your own skin and being able to tell your story without getting wrapped up into it. Because, I've spent way too much of my life wrapped up into it, which a lot of part of my years of the restaurant industry, which was told to me very many years ago, and I still work on this, is if you don't carve, and I think this goes for anybody who wants to be that workaholic, if we don't carve ourselves out of life for it, what are we going to have? And what is our life? Is our life waking up every morning by that sound of the alarm clock, jumping into a job that we like or maybe not like or what for that meaningful? Whereas it's the spiritual connection to one another is really what matters now. It's what survived us as a species this long is the ability to collaborate. And now that we are first time in the history of mankind, we now have three intelligences going on. We have human intelligence, we have AI intelligence, which is new, and we have the one that leads it all is Mother Nature's intelligence. And she's the one that's going to run the show. And when we stop thinking that we're separate from her and rather realize that we are part of that, and realize that the coincidentals and the serendipitous parts of life, the reason why I'm on this show in some ways, is us aligning together with that universe and that said purpose, because we are putting out this frequency. And even in my circle on social media, it's becoming that. I'm putting out this frequency of, if anybody looks at my Facebook page, back in the day, it was about politicals and this and that and throwing mud at each other and all that type of shit. It's not about that anymore. I use my Facebook social media as a digital footprint to show a father's love for his son. So when my grandchildren are going to look me up and they're going to Google me, I'm not going to be hard to find. And when they start to read the words of the transition of going through grief, the Buddhism and what it took for me, and after I got discovered after my son died, into Bardo, the 49 days of Bardo, which after a person passes, you're on universal time, man. You're not on a 24-hour clock. And Bardo is the idea of the transformation into that next realm. And in my eyes and in my belief, beyond the veil is pure truth and love. But that being said, in regards to, say, my family's epigenetical history, there were so many secrets that were not given the light. I believe a lot of my ancestors were held in what you would call purgatory, because they were never able to love the way they were supposed to love. They left secrets behind. Their lives' intentions didn't go the way they wanted to go. And all those things roll into the next generation, whether we know it or not. It melts into our own DNA. And I try to say, bear witness to that and allow people to understand that through their own suffering. And that way they, or their own pain, that they can perhaps take their own suffering and put a purpose to that, whatever it might be. And, so that's kind of been what my message is. And most importantly now, the word I'm trying to get out is, and I can do it from where I'm not a PhD, I don't have a doctorate degree. I sometimes feel my experience is sometimes just as good because it's lived. I'm not reading it out of a book. It's actually stuff that I've had to live with. The darkness of sleeping in squalor and wanting to check out, and the fears of addiction and the compulsiveness of all these things, the PTSD, the survivors of being a survivor of suicide, all these things, and understanding that darkness is one hell of a teacher, right? And understanding the silent tragedies that we're all dealing with that we need to give a voice to. But my big deal is now is, as a chef, I try to focus in on what I can do. And what I believe it is if this ain't right, be in your gut, then this ain't right. And I've been creating a program. It's in its very adolescence, but I've done it in a few small groups to a smooth for kids. And it's called Feed the Fire. The mind, body, and brain fuel for the next generation. And what it does is it becomes a retroflective thought process in kids to understand what serotonin, dopamine, cortisol effects have on the foods that we eat. I created a program that instead of having stuff on your diet, on your menu, that would have hot and spicy and gluten-free and GMO, whatever, the idea is you would have it so it would have like the letter S next to it because it would be good for your skin. It might have the letter M next to it because it's good for your metabolic system. It might have N next to it because of your nervous system, or D for your digestive or joints or your immune system or heart and circulation. So if you were having, say, a pan-seared salmon with a ginger beet emulsion and a seaweed salad, you would actually look at that to say, wow, that's helping my mental health, cognitive. You would read that one dish is doing so much for your body. And if we look at it that way, we might not be so quick to just pick up that comfort food that does absolutely no good for us. Because one of the things that I have to talk about how my son left this world, it was the perfect storm. Okay. He was 17 years of age, obviously dealing with what I called a lot of the ACEs issues of adverse childhood experiences, including the dramas and the traumas that were in and out, woven in and out of his life, from his upbringing, from his childhood. I believe he had an undiagnosed concussion because he had a skateboarding accident a few years earlier. The fact that he was a football player playing for a team that was so recognized. He's banging his head all the time. So concussions are very susceptible in that industry, never fully diagnosed or followed up upon. I also believe that living in South Carolina, he was living in what I call a nutrient desert. Lots of restaurants down there, the Bojangles, the Chick-fil-A, the Applebee's. Zero nutrition in any of that food, but addictive cultures that you're going to want. You can't just eat one Dorito. You can't just eat one Pringle. It's creating neural synapses in your brains. It's making you want to be craving it. So it's just like alcoholism. So the Chick-fil-A becomes that addictive part of your personality. So his gut was dead when he used to come up and visit me, and I would give him wheatgrass and quinoa and beets and kale. He looked at me like I had two heads, you know. But I used to call him a freak of nature. He had a size 14 shoe. It was just like it was just like GMO central, and I used to, joke with him like that. So there was all these perfect storms that were going on, and of course, towards the end, he was drinking, and he was also doing something in my drug history didn't make sense to me because I was never a pill guy, but he was taking Xanax to try to calm himself. And knowing what I know now about what that does to your neural pathways, and if you're taking it off the street and you're trying to regulate yourself, it was the perfect storm, right? And he got mad at his girlfriend, got mad at his mom, and decided that he was this burden, and he did something he couldn't walk back, right? Which happens to so many people, and which is why I work so hard to create what Healthy Minds for Children is, that crisis center for that moment. So therefore, you could jump in the car and call 988, which is the mental health, by the way, is 988. If anybody is suicidal out there, is anybody having some issues out there, it's 988, a national number, just like 911. And they will give you resources. So there is help out there. The idea is I want to make that just so as prevalent as if I slipped and broke my wrist on the ice, that I can go to an ER, get the x-rays, get everything, and put me in a place that I need to go to next. And we don't have that right now when it comes to mental health. You'll go sit in a hospital, and sometimes it takes so much courage just to get into that room. And what happens is you lost that confidence then. Because if you go to that ER and you're sitting there for 10, 12 hours, 17 hours, I've heard some nightmares here, you're not going to do that again. You're going to look at that as, I'm not fucking putting myself through that again. No way in hell. Or you go off to a facility which separates you from your core network of people, regardless of how dysfunctional it might be. But we have to understand that circle of their family constellations also might need the help. They might need to understand what you're going through in a little bit of a different fashion. They might not understand. They might need to have to rephrase that question because they've never understood it for so many years. And then when you look at it, you have this moment. When my brain mapping got on, and the addictive part and the impulsive part and the trauma part were all on reverb 8 years ago, I was like, holy fuck, that makes a lot of sense. And understanding that all these other frequencies were shut down because they were just, everything was a survival mechanism for me. And now I can learn to have discretionary decision making. I can learn to be mindful and peaceful. And even if I get spun out, to realize there's impermanence in it, because nothing lasts forever. Everything changes. And if we can just allow ourselves to let that turbulent stream or that little turbulent moment, let that settle out a little bit and do it with sober eyes, we can become much more clearer as to where our way forward is. And for me, I stay interconnected with my son because I believe he's still with me. I carry his energy with me. I hike with a rock called 85 for Life. It was painted by a friend of mine, but when he died, his number was 85. And the kids came to this funeral with 85 for Life. And I've been like, wow. And in the restaurant business, 85 is better than 86 because then and I don't know if people understand what 86 means. 86, it means that you're out of it. So in the restaurant business, if you're 86th, we don't have any more of the pork chop. We don't have any more of the whatever it is on the menu. It's 86th. And it goes back to actually the speakeasy days when the speakeasy was running around. They would say 86, which meant that you got to get rid of all the booze and hide all the booze and stuff like that, which, again, all part of my, hospitality trains to be a chef, working out with, taking Anthony Bourdain's story and sharing it with my own and using it as more as an advocating voice, not just for the great things that he brought to so many people, but maybe to deal with the things that he wasn't able to deal with and he had to deal with alone in that hotel room that night, that we can be more open to understanding what somebody might be going through. I know for me, I'll ask somebody, how are they doing? And of course they'll say, okay, but I can read them, or I know something that's going on in their life. And I'll be like, really? Come on, let's walk with me, talk with me. And I can't fix it, but I can certainly listen. And at most times, as this podcast does, it shares the story. And we all have a story that needs to be told. And when we lock it in here and feel afraid to talk about it or feel stigmatized to talk about it, it gets trapped. And when it gets trapped in here, bad things can happen. So the idea of what you're doing and so many other people are doing, and what this internet is hopefully going to be, what I like to call humanity strikes back. And we get off our ego and we get off our greed. I mean, greed is always going to be there, but we get off of these things that we create this small self and start to really create what I call the big self of empathy and compassion, and realize that at the end of the day, that's what most matters. That's what most matters, that how we live through our lives and how did our lives affect others. And if we can look at that and been able to feel that we were positive on that note, even if it's a lesson that we helped share or a pitfall that we helped navigate someone through. My greatest AA story is the one that talks about the guy who's in the ditch, and the ditch keeps getting bigger, and he keeps alienating his friends, and he keeps alienating everybody. He's involved with the worst dregs of society. The ditch is bigger and bigger. And he says, help me out of this ditch. And the guy walks by and he says, oh, I can help you. And what's he do? He jumps in the ditch with the guy. And he's like, what are you doing? He says, I've been here before. Let me show you the way. And that way, inch by inch, step by step, believing and having faith and hope and courage to be able to walk through this fire and be able to help out somebody. And coming from a person that when you help somebody and you're going through your own stuff, that's not help anymore. That's love. That's love in its purest form. Because here I am, might be thirsty, but I'm offering you the water first. Whatever God you're talking about, isn't that what it's about? Isn't that really what we're supposed to be here? And how we look at the greatest species of, I think, like ants and bees and all these that's how they work. One for all and all for one. And once we start to create that mechanism in ourselves, which we all have the ability to do, that it doesn't become, Buddhism isn't a religion. It's a way of life. It's a principle that we all found in. It's a path that we walk. And, the other part of Buddhism also talks about why I don't feel that they suffer from as much depression is because this is just merely one life. And if we can do this life well, our next life will be better and it'll be more enlightened. And we keep getting closer to what that is. And sometimes we have to break that old cycle that's been breaking us for so many years and to identify it. And in turn, for me, carrying that light. So that love is my son's light. That love is coming through me. And that's where I'm trying to move forward on. And, taking my story and this place, which I'm hoping to someday to bring back to maybe not the bed and breakfast that it once was, called Evelyn's View, named after my grandmother, but maybe a mental health and spiritual wellness place where I could maybe take some of these silos that are working together, and this could be a collaborative place, perhaps for you to do a nice telethon interview with a variety of different things. Have some, child psychologists and other people that are doing different modalities out there with brain mapping, neurofeedback, and people that are doing stuff with even ketamine treatments and microdosing treatments that are all becoming back in the forefront of helping people with mental health issues. That we get out of this paradox of what pharmaceutical and insurance companies are telling us to do. Because unfortunately, mental health issues, you're on your own, really. I mean, and if we can find a way to navigate through that through mindfulness and meditation and giving kids the tools to be able to navigate this world. And if these kids know how to work this way better than we do, so we don't have to kind of have these technical difficulties. I mean, I always say at work, let the kid fix it, because especially when it's computer orientated, they can fix it better than I can. And it's just, I think that there's a world that's coming that we can even fathom now. I think from your generation, and the younger generation coming up, there's going to be this new evolutionary loop that we're going to come to. That a lot of this hard edge ego of individualism, nationalism, it's going to shade away, because we're going to realize that we need each other. In the book Sapiens, that's what it talks about. Collectively, why have we survived for so many years? It's because of our collective collaboration. And right now, we've been thumping our chest too long, and we take advantage of the fact that this is the only planet that we know of that can conduct this life that we have so brilliantly here. And I think once we really start to connect to all that, realize how we can live within that, there's a lot of great things on the horizon that we can get to. But we have to shed that negativity. We have to shed those things that are holding us back, that no longer suit us. And I think we went quite a bit into this.
Obviously, a lot of memories, a lot of experiences to recollect, bring everything to the front of mind here. I mean, you've just recounted majority of your life there. Does it feel like you could see everything like it was yesterday, or how is your perspective on that with the passage of time?
Sometimes I feel like I've lived a few lives. You know, as I said before, the person I was before August 28, 2016, that person no longer exists. The person, we're always, we're one of the great quotes I like to say is, we are constantly evolving and eroding all at the same time. And sometimes it doesn't happen in that way. Sometimes it can be generational things. I look back on it, and there's so many things that I can look back on and, show regret for, shame for, and stuff. So I try not to really get locked into that old version of myself, because those are the things that always came to mind. So I have to be really careful on the stories I tell myself, because I could get wrapped up into those stories for years. And I have been. I try to look at everything now and through Buddhism as just through the present moment of, this is the life I've been given to me for whatever the reason might be. This is the purpose I'm having here. And I don't necessarily know what that person is, but I start to see these intangible stepping stones, these coincidences, these quantum type of only things that make sense. That, wait a minute, why is this, is this, so I feel that there's a purpose that I'm being drawn to. A friend of mine said to me that your chef life is going to pale in comparison to what you're doing for advocating for mental health. And also, people have said to me, if your son didn't take his life to suicide, would you be advocating for mental health in such a way? Do you think you would still be sober? I mean, these are a lot of mindfuck hypothetical questions, which, sometimes it leaves you wondering, right? So I just have to take things day by day. I really try to get my spiritual connections to the individual people. Like when I have a relationship with somebody now, I try to, it's not superficial. It's not, even though I'm a hockey fan, it's not just about the Rangers game. It's a deeper level of understanding of what's going on in not only the world around us, but in their lives specifically. So I try to be that person that says, "Hey, we can work through this together," or let's come to a meeting, to a Healthy Minds for Children meeting, come to an inspirational Hope Rocks event. Get yourself out of your comfort zone, because at the end of the day, that's how you're going to heal yourself. You know, so many books have helped me along the way that I've seeked out. So the idea that it's it seems like it's so continuous, this path that I'm on. I mean, I feel like I always attribute my life as a hiking path, right? We try to, sometimes it's just like, you're just treachery. You got to walk up to the elevations. You're huffing and puffing. Sometimes the trail loses its, you don't know where the markers are. You got to be careful, especially in the wintertime. The snow can make everything look different. So you really have to pay attention to your footing. And for me, that's the groundingness. That's becoming grounded. That's understanding that, okay, my feet are on the ground here. The restaurant business has always been chaotic. It's always been quick, controlled chaos. So if I start to get too philosophical, I lose it. I get too lost in the past and too worried about the future to really be present in the present. So I just continuously try to do that next right thing. I feel that each of these parts of my journey are all part of a different part of my journey. My journey right now for 8 years obviously will always be, working through grief and understanding that the grief will work through me. But also now I am left to be the caregiver for my mother. I'm the only child. Everybody else is since deceased. My mother has Parkinson's, Lewy body dementia. She's got a broken back. She's got all kinds of normal health issues. Well, elderly health issues. So the most important relationship I can forge is my one with her, because her time here might be limited. I mean, nobody's time is, and we don't know how much sand is in our hands, right? I mean, that's one thing that, my son's life has told me, my uncle's life has told me, my father's life has told me that we're not guaranteed tomorrow, let alone today. So the idea is to live like you just put it all out there. Nathaniel Ratcliffe has that song out there, Leave It All Out There. I kind of want to say, leave it all out there. Go into this messy healing, whatever it might be. My path has always been kind of into that. I call it, on the hiking trail, people would call me I like to call myself, they call me the spiritual barbarian, because the idea is you have to get raw with it. You have to and it's ugly. It's not pretty. It's out of our comfort zone. So the idea is, but that's how you heal. That's when the true healing starts to begin. So I don't look at it. I look at it as a grueling path that we're all just trying to work on. And the more we can get together, the more we can create community together, the more that we can give safe space together is going to be for the greater good. To not only Buddhism, but the Native Americans to live 7, 8 generations ahead is what I believe to be what it should be. So, I try not to take any of that stuff into what I'm here, what I'm not here. I know that it's all fragile, the thread of life. And I certainly look at it that way.
When you were talking about Nicholas before and about how many, I was just struck by how much similarities you two had together, have together. Just your life, how you became very dedicated to a specific thing, him with football, you with the culinary arts, how you both had children when you were younger. Is it kind of trippy when you look at like the similarities between, as father and son, and you see that's like the next chain in the long chain of generations that go by? We're talking about your whole family here. We're talking about going back to your father, your grandfather. You see yourself at where you're at, and then your son, and then grandchildren. But it's very interesting when you recognize all these similarities and you see yourself as just another link in the chain, you know? So how do you feel when you think about these interconnected similarities between yourself, your son, and possibly other family members and just other people that you interact with every day?
Well, a lot of the things that come to me that, my son was, he was the fourth suicide on my father's side of the family. So it's interesting. When we go to the doctor, we talk about, do you have heart condition in your family? Do you have cancer in your family? Do you have suicide in your family? And the idea that to being able to recognize it and becoming aware of it, what I'm trying to do, at least for my story, is to find a way to break that cycle, because my whole family was like that. It wasn't what I was going through wasn't anything new. It was just a different version of it, right? So all the suffering and all the pain that I had gone through my whole life leads me to this day. But and the similarities to my son, it's yeah, it is eerily so. And seeing it almost in a way perhaps repeating itself in my grandchildren. So the only thing to do is to try to get myself spiritually fit and to allow myself to live my life with sober eyes so I can be that reflection of what can be, right? To have that belief of where it doesn't have to be tied to that. Because I've watched this happen at generation after generation, both on my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family, that they're tied to that story. One of the things that, unties that, and I feel helps my grandfather out, is, as I say, my grandfather had all these accolades for all this great invention stuff that he was. But come to find out through all these letters that I had with my grandma, he was an asshole. He was what I guess you would call a narcissist in this day and age. He was self-gratifying, right? He was good at his career. Nobody will ever take that away from him. But his interpersonal relationship, he was kind of a dick, right? He wasn't a good father to my parents. He was, to my mother or his children. He obviously was only separated from his wife and never really truly married my grandmother. So it was kind of like not a nice thing to do. And the fact that he died with, and then when he died, everybody put him up on a pedestal, right? And I feel that now that I start to search, maybe he didn't deserve that, because he was human. We're all human. We all have our flaws. And what I feel that is maybe there was a certain amount of release, because like I mentioned before, that what my belief is beyond the veil is love, and is truth and love in its purest form. So perhaps my grandfather was a little stuck in purgatory because that truth was withheld, because you weren't seeing him in his purest form. You were thinking about how we had him built up to be. How many times do we do that in our lives, right? We put things on a pedestal that don't necessarily should be there, because in those things we don't necessarily, we look at the good side but don't look at the bad side. But to find the true lesson, we have to look at both. And I think that that's what I'm trying to do, and to heal that cycle and to recognize it and to allow it to be what it is. I can't fix it, but I can shed light on it and to allow it. And then hopefully for the generations to come up, we'll see it and maybe not get caught in that trap of to continuously tell themselves the same things I told myself for a good portion of my life. So I try to use that as that path for myself. And the difficult point in that is that sometimes joy and happiness become elusive, because you look at everything as kind of like just sending this message, but how do you do it for yourself to not feel like, okay, let me relish in some of that light myself. Let me bathe in that beautiful light myself. And sometimes those moments are a little bit more fleeting. But I hope to one day that, in this journey, like that path is, sometimes the path you really have to pay attention to. You got to pay attention to your footing. And I feel like I'm still on that, have to have sure footing path, because I know my addiction's out there doing push-ups. It's waiting for life to come hit me again. We're all going to get throat punched by the universe at some point. So it's about being able to navigate those things in healthy manners. And that's the that's the cycle I'm trying to break from the original, right? To numb ourselves, to suppress it. I'm trying to let it be to the light and let it be free and let it go. And then in that way, allowing it to stop carrying the rocks, stop carrying the burden. And then in doing so, and I find that actually works. And I think the cure to a lot of it is through gratitude. Gratitude is the greatest gift that we give ourselves when we allow ourselves to be grateful, not just for the roof over our head or the shoes on our feet, but for the amazing connections we find with each other, right? The people we find into our lives that help us along the way, whether they're strangers that we meet at the coffee shop or people that have been interwoven into our lives our whole life. You know, that's where it really, those are the true grateful, relishing moments that you find. And we have to be present to get them, right? So I think that those are the things that, and a lot of people, we become so ungrateful for so many things, and everything is, 2 day shipping type of gratitude. You know what I mean? So, oh, I need to feel grateful. Let me go buy this and this. So it shows up at my door 2 days later. And then that fades. And we realize that that box did not give us the void that we were looking for, right? So, and nothing's going to fill that void until we find a way to nourish it ourselves.
It's pretty clear that spirituality has played a big role in the healing process for you and for so many people out there. How did you first become acquainted with Buddhism and with spirituality as a whole? And can you just speak to spirituality and how that has helped you on your journey?
I've always been connected to philosophy, I guess you would say. I've always been questioning, why are we here? What is our purpose? I used to take philosophy school at the School of Practical Philosophy. I've always been in trying to embrace what I've always been searching for, which is the deepest is love, right? I mean, they say it's all love. Everything is just resistance to it, right? And it's always been the elusive thing to try to find. So in my spirituality, I've always dealt with the Native American beliefs of only leaving footprints, to take homage to the God, to the river that sits behind me, the different parts of the history of the seasons of that, the histories of which the homage to which history was brought to it. Like when I speak to the people about creating a society like St. Jude's for mental health here in the Hudson Valley, the reason why I say that is because this area is one of the oldest parts of the planet, being the whole Appalachian Trail and this whole East Coast. At the beginning of forging of this planet, this area lineage goes back that far. Our mountain ranges tie into the European range when the continents were connected, and how paying homage to that. During the Native American days, this was the UN of its day because of its bounty of the resources. It was the land between the two great rivers of the Delaware and the Hudson. It was flourishing with everything that could be given. Overlook Mountain was the UN of its day. Tribes would come far as like South, Jersey and Delaware to Canada to come down and have this. The birth of a nation, being the United States, was actually forged within these riverbanks. From West Point to Saratoga, if we look at the Revolutionary War, George Washington's headquarters was in Newburgh. The idea that this was the forging of a nation, this thing of this vision of something that wasn't yet to be. I would even go on to say that we were the dawning of, look at what happened with the Roosevelt and the barons of the world, the Rockefeller estates, the Vanderbilt. They all lived here in the Hudson Valley. The trains, that all started here. It was all part of this region. So the idea of the energy that this creates and the lineage that this creates, I would go to even talk about the 60s with IBM, the dawning of the internet, the dawning of all these things. IBM was a strong and still is the cornerstone of a lot of this stuff. I would even go to say the environmental movement through Pete Seeger and the Clearwater Foundation. Look at what the arts did through Woodstock, the festival that changed which is world renowned. This area has been a hotbed for that. It still is. The modalities that are out there, from brain mapping to yogis to sound therapy to different types of treatments, it's all throughout here. Our culture and agriculture is deep. We have a lot of organic farms around here. We have community based organizations. We have communities where I work that are still attached by sidewalks. We all care about each other's neighbors, and that's where those grassroots type of things happen. So my spirituality has always been founded in that interconnectedness. Um, One of my great teachers in the restaurant business has always said that, our Buddhism part of the restaurant business is I can take your day and make it a little bit brighter, right? By giving you a great meal, or, giving you a nice drink, or giving you this ability to talk about your problems. Hey, that's what the bartender's for, right? The bartender sometimes had a degree in psychology because you needed to. That meant that person could go home and maybe treat their wife better or their kids better, or give something a little bit back. So I've always felt that there was a deep interconnection. The bench that sits out here, this beautiful stone bench that overlooks this river that's been there long before I have, I used to sit there, and I still sit there, and I listen and I watch the world that goes around us. Depending on the day of the week, I can hear the energy of Poughkeepsie going on. I could see the trains, the freight trains, the barges, watch the tides and the ice flows depending on the season, the eagles and the wildlife, and just sit there. And sometimes I feel like I'm the only one doing this right now. Because if I look around, everything is moving. Yet I'm just trying to stay present. And it's not our game, right? We have to be moving. We have to be moving towards something. But it's really in our, what I call the sit spot. The Native Americans taught it. Talk about this. The idea that when we allow things to come to us, they naturally will come to us, right? And then when we put in the Thich Nhat Hanh dealing, is prayer and meditation are one thing, but you must put those into action, because otherwise they do us no good. So the things that I find with the mountains that are all within us, that we have this ability within us, no matter what we're going through, that as long as we realize and we reach out and we connect to ourselves and our deeper part of ourselves, we can help one another to create that. And of course, Buddhism, Native American, any religion is going to create that interconnectionness to it. It's when it gets to the extreme that I think is where our problems lie. And that's where the ego comes in. And for me, I've had to learn to lose that over the years, because I was a Gordon Ramsay type in the kitchen. Well, this is the way we're going to do it, and this is it. And, if you didn't like it, I would start screaming and hollering and throwing pots and pans. Well, that become a domino effect. Now I got a waitress that's wigged out and she's afraid to ask questions. I got chefs that are working nervously and not producing correctly. But when we start to become a little bit more flow, they end up buying into the system. They end up buying into the program, and now everybody's being more enveloped and more power. And then rather than having one light, you have two. And that's where things start to really get stronger. And I've been able to bear witness through that, through the grief groups, the AA groups, the people in recovery, and the people who keep holding on to hope and belief.
It's so unusual how there's such a still, maybe we're moving out of it, but a stigma, like some sort of collective stigma, maybe ingrained into our culture or something. With when it comes to mental health, it's odd because we place such an emphasis on physical health. We have gyms, we have centers that people can go to work on their physical self. But it's so strange how, as a culture, we have really taken a step back and really have tried to ignore the underlying mental health issues that we have as a society. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how can we as a society move forward and away from this stigma and to a brighter, healthier, holistic future.
In going to that, one of the things I'd like to impart into everybody's lifestyle, and AA taught me this, is this 12 steps. First part of what we're going through about the stigma is we have to come to radical acceptance. And the first thing in AA they teach you is, hello, my name's Michael. I'm an alcoholic and an addict. Radical acceptance right there. I'm accepting to who I am and what it is. The problem comes to where we are is what I've been calling, and I wrote a piece about it called cognitive dissonance. We have become so disconnected to who we truly are. One of the great things that groups I've gotten involved in, and there's been many, but there's this one that works out of northern Dutchess County called 13 Hands Equine. And they're a horse rescue place. And they've done a lot of great stuff with people suffering through mental health because, believe it or not, these 25, 1,500-pound beasts can see through us. They know people. They're doing great work with vets. They're doing great work with kids who have autism and spectrum disorders. These animals, these become gentle. It's like they see us. And there's a thing that they talk about early on in their introduction to this group that said about 150 years ago, the equine was our companion. It's what we lived with. It's what got us around. The Native Americans would actually speak to their horses, and they would believe their horses would speak back to them. And if you talk about the spirituality of what the horse means as your animal, it's everything. It's your messenger. It's life. It's death. It's the power of getting up. It's the wild Mustang within ourselves, right? This beast that is so powerful, right? Yet so gentle. And the ones that we relied upon for everything that we did. We rode these animals into battle. They plowed our fields. They gave us our livelihood. Well, 150 years ago, we severed that relationship, which is where the beginning, I feel, of this cognitive dissonance started. We started to disconnect ourselves into the things, into the consumerism, into these other things. And we were given this idea, especially like when I was growing up, is shut up or I'll give you something to cry about. You know, the idea is suck it up, buttercup, move on. You know, the idea that we never allowed ourselves to feel those pains and to understand what a person, and we glossed it and we swept it under the rug. And what happened now is that rug is piled up with a bunch of stuff. And until we find a way to unveil that and really look at it, is the only way we're going to get it through it. And unfortunately, it's not always a pretty picture. But when we do that, it's magnificent on what the result becomes. Because now we just enlightened ourselves and we can move beyond it. And then we realize these things that were holding us back were kind of silly. You know, at the end of the day, it was fear, right? And we should never let fear decide our fate. And so many times we live in a world that we're afraid, whether it's a situation where we're just afraid of culture, or we're afraid of our emotions and how we feel or how it's going to affect somebody. But I wear my sobriety and I wear my mental health on the sleeve. I've always done that. And I think in doing so, we open up that door to lose that stigma. And it's a slow process, but I see it happening all around us. I see it might not be happening quick enough, but it is starting to happen because it no longer can be ignored, because our physical health and our mental health are completely intertwined. You know, it's the myth of normal is out there. You know, we have this myth of what we call normal. And another great book out there is The Body Keeps Score. You know, all the stuff that we've been showered with our whole life, the body knows. It understands it, it reacts to it. And we got to learn to start shedding those masks, because at the end of the day, we don't need them. We want to be our true, authentic self. Our best self is when we're being true and authentic. And that's when we're stopping to be somebody else. It's our only way forward to live to our story and live with our authenticity, and not to compare, but to be able to identify and then be able to rebuild. And that's what I truly try to look for. And it exists in different silos, like I say. And it's about being able to, how do we create that network to be able this ability to truly bring it all together. And that's what I'm hoping to see in our lifetime, that these type of things become the regular. These type of communications, these type of forums, these type of things become the future because this is what we're going to need. AI is going to take care of all the other shit. It's going to take care of all this. It's going to do it better. I hate to say it, but we need to learn how to connect to ourselves better if we're going to find that way forward. And that is going to be through the arts, through music. I mean, I think we get music right. As a species, I think we can argue music all through the course of history has the thing that we have gotten right because we are vibration. And regardless of what your genre is, everybody's making some great music out there. There's great vibration coming through that. Journaling is another great way to move great medicine. Taking that emotion and putting it into language, taking that emotion and putting it into a poem, taking that emotion and putting it into a writing that talks about what you're going through. There's two things that happen there. Number one, you're taking that thing in your mind and you're transferring it into words. You say those words to another person, you're giving other layers of healing and shedding that stigma. So I think that that's how it gets done. It's not going to be some flick of the switch and all of a sudden here we are. It's about these little increments of steps that are going to happen and are happening.
I feel like it needs to be, if we're going to destigmatize mental health, we really have to bring, like you said, radical acceptance, actually bring the conversation to the forefront. Do you think that the stigma exists still in some ways because it's a difficult conversation for people to have? It's just, and they would rather not have these conversations because it's like, it's something that, okay, it's going to open up wounds and they just would rather not have to deal with that.
What you have with that is that you're never going to get outside your comfort zone. And if you continuously stay in your comfort zone, then it's going to be very difficult to find a way to go to heal yourself, regardless of what it is. The 30-day chips and getting sober, the first 90 days for me, and having before 90 days the word that my son took his life to suicide. When I sat on the phone with my sponsor, I didn't know his story. I knew he was an alcoholic. He wore a Grateful Dead T-shirt, so I was like, "That's my sponsor, somebody I could relate to, right?" With his steely head. So I was like, that was the guy I wanted to be my sponsor, because when you go into the rooms, you need to take those steps. You got to make those efforts. Then you have to have the radical acceptance back. Then you have to go back and make a penance. You got to say sorry for the way you treated people and the way things were. So there's this whole process that we really have to work towards. And then the end of it is that 12th step where you give it back. And that's what, Buddhism talks about this, is find out what your gift is. And then what do you do with your gift is you give it away, right? So the idea is you have to be able to be willing to not only be able to allow somebody to listen to what and it's going to happen over time. It doesn't just, you might have to revisit that a few times until a person will be ready, because you can only meet somebody where they're at. I mean, that's a big thing I deal with people who are going through serious addiction issues right now that still reach out to me. As much as, oh, come to a yoga class to me, or come to this and do this, let's go to, they ain't there yet. They're still trying to struggle in that first 72 hours of staying off the stuff. They're still trying to stay away from the drink or the bottle or the needle or whatever it is. They're just trying to keep themselves grounded. So you have to be able to be there for them at that moment to make sure that, don't do this. This isn't your way. You have to change your routine. So, and the idea of that butterfly effect is, no matter what that negative part of who you are is, there's also a great and beautiful part that is a positive part of who you are. So the idea is, how do you turn the one down that's not so good and turn up the one that is so good? And different ways to find that out. I do think through the awareness and meditation and teaching this young is huge. I do think about educating about what cortisol levels are, dopamine receptors, serotonin. It's never talked about in school. I didn't know much about my brain until later on in life. And it's the most valuable piece of equipment. It's way more powerful than the thing that we're working on right now, this computer, right? It's way more powerful than that. And we have to understand how it works. It's keeping us breathing. It's keeping us mindful. It's feeling every moment of everything. So how do we become, allowing, being a master of our mind and our thoughts, and allowing ourselves to understand those are just thoughts. And there's a meditation I like to use that takes you through this beautiful mountainscape to the beautiful fields of flowers. And eventually it leaves you gently along this stream. And as thoughts might come and go, you just let it be that leaf that floats gently down the stream. And the only way that thought hurts you is when you grab hold of it, right? If that's the thought that if it's a negative thought, if once we grab hold of it, we realize that that's when we start to then our when we get our attention, we give our attention grows. So if it's a positive thing, that's great. We continue on that path. If it's out of our comfort, keep going on that path. If it's something that's bringing us to negativity, then maybe we have to learn to let it go. I know earlier on I used to collect pine cones and stones and rocks from different hikes, from Mount Washington to the Shenandoah Valley, and all these great spots up in Maine, and all these. And I had this whole sanctuary towards my son. On New Year's Day, I would always do a hike, and I would go to Minnewaska, because Minnewaska was considered the mountains of the gods, because it was in white. It's all beautiful white rock. If you've never been there, the two lakes, Owasting and Minnewaska, both do not have any fish. The Native Americans believed that the waters were so pure that not even life would live in it. It was only meant for the gods to be so pure. So the Owasting Falls that runs through that, I had a pine cone that I had carried around in my son's altar that came from Mount Washington for years. The hardest thing I had to do for 8 minutes of my life was to let that pine cone go in that stream. It was the hardest thing I had to do in that moment, was just to take this little pine cone that was holding on, in my mind, the memory of my son and all these things that I held dear. And somehow I just had to drop it in the stream and let it float away. And I did it. But for that moment, it was hard. I carried around in my backpack, like this rock I carry around all the time in my hiking pack. When I take pictures and selfies, I'll have this with me, so it believes that my son's with me. I've been able to do other things where I've been able to take my son's ashes, and I've spun them into a beautiful stone piece that, under illumination, you can actually see. It's kind of beautiful. Those are his ashes in there. So I have this ability. I put it in a marble form too, so I can take it to talks and keep it in my pocket, and have something in my hand to rub, to feel that connection. And sometimes that's all it takes. Rocks, pine cones. When we're having these anxieties and these uncomfortable situations, have something that's with you that's comfortable. Talk about things that, so you can kind of bring yourself to another level. So you're not entrenched in the pain, but you're learning to find a way to release it, because it does no good for you in here. It's doing more harm than good, holding on to it. And that's why we have people with rage issues. A lot of people say, why am I so, I learned, there's a saying that says, I realized my anger was just grief, because we were sad about something and didn't know how to. As a little kid, you don't know how to react to it. So how does it come out? It comes out as a temper tantrum. So we're essentially like these grown ass adults not knowing how to cope, and it comes out in that manifestation. So it's not to say that we're perfect individuals. We're all going to have our moments, but to be able to recognize them, to become aware to them, understand what's causing them, and then be able to address them and be able to work through them in that moment or over the course of time, because it's not a quick fix. And we look for this quick fix that, okay, I got to go, and it's not like that. We have to be more flexible with our time and more flexible with our energy.
So how do you bring all of these realizations that you've had into your everyday life, specifically into the kitchen? How do you take, I know it's really your work as a chef is kind of like your dharma in a way, right? It's like it's your sacred work, actually. How do you take your realizations when it comes to mental health and then try to manifest that in a way into your daily life? I know you mentioned that you've tried to work with the menu and have a more holistic breakdown of things, where you actually have the benefits listed on there. Is that one way, or what are some other ways?
Well, that's one way. Of course, it's difficult sometimes. I work for somebody who's my boss, and a lot of times A lot of the stuff and the ingredients I like to get are a little bit more expensive. So that affects my food costs. And my boss is like, shut up, you're going to use this. But the idea is I can at least plant the seeds, right? So even if I'm not able to exactly produce everything I wanted to do, because I did try that a few times and my food costs went through the roof and my boss was on my ass all the time about it. Like, all right, listen, we can do a certain part of your menu to it, but we can't adopt the whole thing to it, right? Because at the end of the day, we're in a capitalistic society, unfortunately, and we're all beholden to the mighty dollar. So there's a part of it that I have to kind of understand. I can only do with what I can. But in that, and also working in a place that I worked at, I work in a very, also saying my age, a very cheers orientated type of place. Everybody, if everybody, people probably don't even know this series of Cheers many years ago. Everybody knows your name. It's a community organization where it's family. If I were to, when I worked corporate, I was working corporate when my son passed. I left corporate when my boss came into me after I was 6 months into my grief. He says, I've given you 6 months. Haven't you gotten over it yet? We gave you 4 days worth of bereavement pay. That was the end of that. That was the end of that. I was just like, are you kidding me? And we don't do that. No matter what anybody's going through. In the corporate world, if your parents or your spouse or your loved one is going through something traumatic, you better leave it at the door because this is a business. This isn't your personal life. And I know from the restaurant business that everybody's carrying something because I see it. I see it because I bear witness to it because I cater to it. Remember, I cater to the wedding. I cater to the baby shower. I cater to the bridal shower. I cater to the funeral. So I'm in the mix of it all. I'm in the mix of the guy coming in with his wife. I'm in the mix with the wife coming in with the person that maybe she's not supposed to be with, right? So I'm in the mix of all this stuff. So for me, I like to say that in my life, and especially how I work with my therapist, you can't have any secrets. It's so much better to live a truthful life because then you don't have to worry about what you said, right? And so many times we're putting up these masks and we're putting up this facade of who we feel we're supposed to be. This, I call it in the restaurant business, machismo, right? I've got, we're an ego driven business. I remember back in the day when I was really working in the city, you had to kick your game up against the guy that you were working next to, you know? And now I try to work it a little bit more as we're a team. We become a unit. So I try to make sure that I lead by example. I make things fun and I keep it playful. And I make sure that I never forget that we're human beings having a spiritual journey, or actually spiritual beings having a human experience and not a spiritual being having a human experience. So I never let us be disconnected from that part of our spirituality. And that, working in a small mom and pop Cheers type of organization allows you to do that, right? So it allows me to be part of that, family, and you create that network of being with people. And in those type of modes, you create these seeds, and a lot of times they keep root. I have people that I've worked with in this industry that still keep in touch with me, how much they've admired me to not only walk through this walk, but how they still reach out to me and how I taught them. My kitchen staff follows me. I'll work for different restaurants. I have one person that's been with me for two different places now. When I leave, she leaves. So it's like, they buy into what you're doing and they want to be part of it. And that's the beautiful part of what it is. When we start to heal ourselves, we become network and light for that help. And people want to be part of that. So that's how that works. And, if that means I have to walk in, and walk through the hot coals and carry fire and carry water for other people in that fire, then that's what I choose to do. Hence that spiritual barbarian thing. Because as an only child, one of the things that also gave me in being in that, I'm not afraid to walk into any room. I'm not easily intimidated. I've seen a lot of things in my life. I've catered to a lot of people in my life. We all put our pants on one leg at a time. We all have our own story to tell. So it's not like I'm ever afraid to allow myself to have, now I should say, I'm not afraid to let my guard down, and be that genuine, authentic human being that I think we all need to do. And I think in doing so, that's where we start to gain the momentum of shedding all that, because we're all dealing with it and it's happening one way or another. That's why I'm saying it's human evolution, and Mother Nature is going to take care of this for us. We're just now becoming aware of it. So as things start to become, Mother Nature is going to change it. And that's why I say the stuff of ego and greed and narcissism, even though those are the ugly parts of humanity, empathy, compassion, generosity, gratitude, those are truly things that bring us light. And those are the things that of our ender days are the things that we're going to remember the most. I mean, what is she, Angela Davis says? They might forget what you did, they might forget what you said, but you'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's really what we come down to. And that's when we leave this world, that's what we can all hope to aspire to, right? So I feel that those are how we break down those walls is, you know, just keep going at it.
You've talked a lot about your time hiking and how that brings you happiness. What are some things that bring you peace in this life?
I feel a lot of it does become about the advocacy, to feeling like you're making a difference, to understanding that, people coming, I did an event that somebody just heard me on an interview, just promoting the event, and ended up traveling like a 90 minutes away to show up. She had just lost her husband to suicide. And the idea that in that person's life, in that moment, you made a difference. I still reach out to her near and there, but I understand that it's still very raw to her. So you have to meet them where they are. But the idea that you've already felt that you made a difference there, and doing stuff like this, there is a rub to it though sometimes. And it's completely out of normal thinking. It's almost, mystical thinking in some way, that you try to barter. That somehow, all right, I did this Hope Rocks event, I did this talk, I did this podcast, I made this advocacy thing, we're done, right? My son's coming back, right? This was some just horrible joke, right? It's completely unfucking rational, right? But you're always longing that somehow that, and of course it's difficult for somebody who has suicidal ideation to say, oh, they'll say to you, oh, you get to meet him in your next life. Well, for me, sometimes that's a selling point, right? If that's the first person I'm going to meet, it means that I'm not afraid of dying. I know that much, because as they say, that's a selling point. If I know that the first person I'm going to see on the other side of that light is going to be the renewing of my son, and maybe even my father and all these other people, but I can't look at it like that. What I have to look at is that I still have a mission and a purpose here. They are there on that side of the veil doing what they can. And what I can do is use their collective energy to try to do it from what I am at, where I'm at. And if I can use that medium to express my message and get it out there to hopefully change things, to maybe create that St. Jude's for mental health here in the Hudson Valley, to maybe create this lifetime of thing like the woman who lost her daughter to a drunk driving accident, changed policies, became more awareness. So if we can do those things through grassroots organizations, through changing our protocols and how we look at mental health, then we really have done something. And then to say, oh wow, once we get beyond this, then how far can we actually go? And when we look at it, it can be pretty magnificent, So I try to do it. One of the things I like to, and it's a friend that just recently passed away, and it's that faint St. Francis prayer of "Let me be an instrument of thy peace." It's a beautiful song. There's a great mantra to it. There's a bunch of Sanskrit about it, so it's interwoven into many different religions. So the idea is, you know, let me, let me know love where there is injury. Let me know where there's doubt, there's faith. So the idea is to be able to intertwine those things through love and through compassion, and use that as the conduit to make this message happen. You know, and I do that every day in my chef's life. I had a woman that was she's she's from Guatemala. She's a single mother. She's my dishwasher. She was scared to death she's been scared to death since this election, to be quite honest with you, for certain reasons, obvious reasons. Her daughter was sick the other day, and she was nervous that she was going to lose her job. And I was like, what do you, no, it's completely fine. Take care of your daughter. Stay home until you need to. We will take care of it. It's not, please. And then I said some personal words to her, which should cause language barrier because I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I wanted her to know that it's okay. You don't need to stress about this, that we are part of this family that will be there to take care of you. And right now, your daughter needs you because her daughter was 2 years of age and having a high temperature and stuff. And take as long as you need. You know, we will be here to take care of you. If you need food, so there's all this other part of it. And once you do that, you empower somebody, and then they realize that they're not alone. And that's probably the greatest gift you can give a person that's feeling alone.
We've talked a lot about the past. We're trying to focus a lot on the present here. What does the future look like for you as far as you can see it? How moving forward are you trying to turn pain into purpose?
Well, I feel like sometimes I'm sitting here with two rocks together trying to build a fire and create that spark. And I feel that sometimes there becomes a spark to it. I do see that there's a lot of struggles with it, especially my advocacy with the Hope Rocks advisory board. They're a group that works out of Saugerties. We've been having issues in the past few events, the past few years. The first year we had like 2,500, 3,000 people that showed up. This past year we had 900. So there's a disconnect. So why aren't people looking to see that, as we were talking about, the stigma is so high? So we're trying to retool ourselves to find out how can we get our message out there a little bit clearer. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of challenges here. But if we can break down some of these silos and create this collective groundswell and get a lot of these different mental health collaboratives and Healthy Minds for Children and Hope Rocks and Maya Gold and all these great organizations to bound together rather than living in silos, that voice is going to get louder and that purpose is going to get louder. And eventually we're going to have to do that. And if we can find the right philanthropist in this era, and I'm talking to you, Peter Buffett, who lives in the Hudson Valley, mind you, has the wherewithal to be able, and Nuvance Foundation, they have the wherewithal to be able to do this. Even the fucking Elon Musks of the world and the Bioses of the world could solve these problems overnight if they got off their egos, right? If they could go out and heal the world and say, what better can I do to the world rather than the things of more I can accumulate from the world, we'd be so much better off. And I think that that's the narrative I keep have to pushing. And I have to, like a kid that had to stand up to the bully, right? And I'm not afraid to do that. So the idea is that even in that darkness, I will be there to help that person through that point. So the idea is to, be that person, to be able to stand with them through that dark time, to be that lighthouse through them in the darkness, to be the person that helps be that light through that time and understand that they're not alone, and the organizations that are out there to do it. And there are so many great organizations that are there. So I see the idea that we need to create that light to be a greater beacon of light. Groups like this are going to be coming more frequently. They're already here. This is, as I say, the third one I've done like this. Perhaps the deepest one, however, as far as emotionally speaking. But it's an important part of how we find a way to heal ourselves. And everybody has to do that journey on their own, but they don't have to do it alone. And we realize that we can be there for them. And I think that there's great things on the horizon for where this can be. And once it starts to break through, man, how quickly it can change. That's the thing that, if anything, can take us how quickly because we have to be learned to become adaptable. That's how we've survived, is our adaptability. And we're learning to adapt to this form of our intelligence of being the computer. Once that melts into our society more, we will be able to do that better. Right now, it's a lot of bad actors, a lot of bad players. But I feel once that starts to filter down and we start to really fine tune this in a better way, we are going to really have this quantum leap of evolving. And we could look to what I believe is we're on this dawning of this renaissance, is where I really think we're headed. Even though people are like, how can you say that? It looks like there's a lot of darkness ahead. Well, all that stuff happened on dark times. All those renaissance happened after, as a precursor of dark times, because we had, even with myself, my healing didn't come to till I was cracked wide open and brought to my knees through my son's suicide. Even though I tried all those years before, it didn't really come to fruition until I was throat punched like I was. And I hope that we don't have to all go through that we can do it more, holistically and naturally, rather than having to be, brought to our knees in that way, that it doesn't have to come from that point, that we can take life by other people's examples and realize that, okay, let me find my way through this and be able to create that evolutionary traits that will heal our society. And I think we have that ability to evolve in that manner. And for all of our sakes, I believe that that's where, that's how we create that inner peace. Mother Nature is what you mentioned. It's the reset. There's studies where 3 days on the wood in the woods with no devices, the stress, the depression, the PTSD, the anxiety, it all releases itself because we become more fluid with it. So I think that that's what it is. And I believe that there's great things on the horizon when it comes to this. But unfortunately, there's a lot of messiness that's got to come first. That's just how healing goes.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you for your time today, for bearing your soul. I mean, we've discussed a lot, but this is a very positive conversation, very real conversation too. We've really like got into so many things. I mean, really just talking about specifically mental health and having these conversations that are, some people would like to sweep under the rug, but actually illuminating these kinds of conversations and trying to make sense of things. I think it's extremely valuable. And I just want to thank you again for your time today. I mean, this is great. And just people just out there, like some people just listening to the story, no matter who they are, hopefully just, it can just, it'll just click with someone, the words that were shared today. So it means a lot. And I really want to thank you for your time. Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss today?
Well, we just, there's so many great things that are out there. As I say, there's a bunch of great books. The Body Keeps Score, The Myth of Normal, Walking the Tiger, which is healing trauma, The Mountain is in You, of course, The Way Forward, anything by Thich Nhat Hanh, No Mud, No Lotus, any of those things. All those things are great, are great avenues to continue our journey in finding a way to heal one another and to walk ourselves home, and to know that you don't have to do it alone, but it is an individual journey, and we do have to find and seek out what's going to be best for yourself. Don't ever lose hope. Sometimes, it's great to look back on the memories. There's some things in memories that can bring you to tears knowing that they're no longer here, but they bring you to tears knowing that they at least existed, right? So you keep that in your mind about the beautiful things. Don't highlight somebody in their worst moment. Highlight the people in their best moment, and a lot of times we have a difficult time doing that to ourselves. And let's just keep shining our light to people. Let us know that we don't have to walk this journey alone. And keep on keeping on. And I am you and you are me. It's all wrapped into that's been there before, and just keep seeking it out. You know, I trust you. If no matter what anybody's going through right now, it might not be today or might not be tomorrow, but you keep going. It will get better. Keep doing the next right thing. Keep giving yourself self care. It will get better. And I just wish everyone the highest of good out there. And I appreciate this opportunity to be able to bare my soul and share my story of strength, hope, experience, and courage. And I hope somebody and people are able to, build on this and reach out to me. I'm pretty open on social media as Chef Michael Dederick. Chef Michael Dederick is my name on Facebook and Instagram. So I'm out there, and most of my stuff is all built on how I feel going forward and how to create that net. So thank you, Joe, for everything, my man. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you again for sharing your story. This means a lot. Thank you.
Excellent. And I mean to as well.
Yeah,
Namaste, my friend.
thank you. You as well.